Hello friends, welcome to Book Dark Reader. Today we are going to talk about Psychology of Human Behavior by John B. Watson. This book exposes and addresses the uncomfortable truth that most of what you call your personality is actually a set of conditioned reactions you never consciously chose. Let me be honest with you right away. Most people like to believe they are in control of their actions. They believe their decisions come from intelligence, values, or willpower. Watson doesn't start by comforting that belief. He quietly dismantles it. He suggests that human behavior is shaped far more by environment, repetition, and reward than by inner morality or intention. This is not a pleasant idea. If it were, more people would already be free. Now you might be thinking this sounds extreme. You might want to defend yourself and say, "That's not me. I think before I act." This is where the book gently but firmly pulls the ground from under your feet. Watson argues that most thinking happens after action, not before it. We act first, then justify. This line might make you uncomfortable, because once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Watch how quickly you explain your habits instead of questioning them. Behavior, in this framework, is not a mystery. It is a pattern. And patterns are built through conditioning. When an action leads to comfort, approval, or relief, it repeats. When it leads to pain or rejection, it fades. Over time, the brain stops asking questions. It learns shortcuts. This is efficient, but it is also dangerous. Because once a pattern becomes automatic, it stops asking whether it still serves you. This is where most people fail. They try to change their lives by changing their thoughts. They read affirmations. They chase motivation. But the book insists that behavior changes first, and the mind follows later. If you don't interrupt the behavior, the thought will return to protect it. Be honest with yourself. How many times have you understood something deeply, yet continued doing the same thing? Watson's view removes the romance from self-improvement. There is no heroic inner battle here. There is only stimulus and response, situation and reaction. You are not lazy, weak, or broken. You are trained. And what has been trained can be retrained. That should feel relieving, but it often feels threatening instead. Because it removes the comforting excuse that change is impossible. Here is where people stop reading. Because accepting this means accepting responsibility at a level most people avoid. If your behavior is conditioned, then your environment matters more than your intentions. And that means the places you stay in, the people you tolerate, the routines you repeat are silently deciding your future. This is not a theory. This is a mirror. Think about a simple habit. Reaching for your phone when you feel even a trace of boredom. This is not just a story, this is your habit. At some point, boredom was followed by stimulation. The brain learned the connection. Now the urge appears before you even notice boredom. You tell yourself you chose to scroll, but the choice was made long ago, by repetition. Watson pushes this idea further. He suggests that emotions themselves can be conditioned. Fear, confidence, avoidance, attraction, none of these are as natural as we believe. They are learned responses to earlier experiences. If this is true, then your current fears are not proof of danger. They are memories pretending to be warnings. You've done this too, haven't you? Avoided something not because it was harmful, but because it once felt uncomfortable. This is where the book becomes dangerous. Because once you understand that emotions can be trained, you lose the excuse of, "This is just how I am." That sentence collapses. And when it collapses, something else appears in its place, the question of why you've allowed certain conditions to train you in the first place. Watson famously wrote, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select." This line is short, but it is explosive. He is not talking about talent. He is talking about control. The danger of this quote is not that it might be wrong. The danger is what it implies if it is even partially right. If environment shapes behavior this deeply, then neglecting your environment is a silent form of self-destruction. If you ignore this, you will keep blaming yourself for outcomes that were quietly engineered by repetition and context. You will keep trying harder instead of changing conditions. And trying harder without changing conditions is how people exhaust themselves without progress. Be honest, have you avoided changing your environment while demanding that your willpower compensate for it? That tension you feel right now is not resistance. It is recognition. The book does not let you stay comfortable for long. It moves from understanding to confrontation. Once you see behavior as learned, you must also see that learning never stops. Every reaction you repeat is a vote for the person you are becoming. Every time you tolerate a pattern, you reinforce it. There is no neutral behavior. There is only reinforcement or decay. This is no longer about theory. This is about tonight, tomorrow morning, and the next small decision you will tell yourself does not matter. It matters more than the big ones. Because big changes scare people, but small repetitions define them. A small win appears here, quietly. If behavior is shaped by patterns, then you don't need to overhaul your life. You need to interrupt one loop. Just one. But this is also where resistance appears. Because interrupting a loop feels like discomfort, and discomfort feels like danger to a conditioned mind. If you're lying to yourself, don't continue. Because the next question the book forces you to face is not about psychology anymore. It's about whether you are willing to feel temporary discomfort to escape permanent patterns. And if you're not, there's something far more important you need to understand next. Before we go any further, you need to notice something subtle that already happened. You didn't just read ideas. You felt slightly exposed. That reaction matters. Watson would say that even your discomfort right now is a learned response. You were trained to feel uneasy when responsibility gets too close. That's not an insult. That's an observation. And once you see it, the conversation shifts from abstract psychology to something much more personal. The book now moves into a territory most people misunderstand. Conditioning is not just about obvious habits. It's not only about smoking, scrolling, or procrastinating. It's about how quickly you comply with expectations, how easily you retreat from conflict, how often you silence an impulse before it even reaches your mouth. These are behaviors too, and they were reinforced long before you knew what reinforcement meant. Let me be honest with you. Most people believe they choose their reactions in social situations. They think they are polite because they are kind, quiet because they are thoughtful, agreeable because they are mature. Watson challenges this by asking a colder question. What happened the last time you didn't comply? If disagreement once led to rejection, embarrassment, or punishment, the body learned the lesson faster than the mind could process it. This is not just a story. This is your habit. You smile when you want to object. You nod when something feels wrong. You delay conversations you know you need to have. And later, you tell yourself it was strategic or peaceful. But deep down, you know it was avoidance wearing a reasonable mask. Here's where the book becomes sharp. Watson argues that behavior is maintained not by logic, but by consequences. And the most powerful consequences are immediate ones. Relief, approval, safety. The brain doesn't care if a behavior ruins your future as long as it protects your present. That's a dangerous system to leave on autopilot. Now you might be thinking, okay, but awareness changes things. Not as much as you'd like. Awareness without behavioral interruption only creates frustration. You see the pattern, but you keep living inside it. Over time, that gap between knowing and doing creates a new emotion, quiet self-contempt. This is where many intelligent people get stuck. They understand themselves very well and still feel powerless. This is where people stop reading. Because the next idea removes another comforting illusion. Watson suggests that self-control is not a trait. It is a result of controlled conditions. People who appear disciplined are often just supported by environments that reduce temptation and increase consistency. People who struggle are often fighting conditions that constantly trigger old responses. If that sentence irritated you, pay attention to that irritation. It might be protecting a belief you rely on, that struggling means something is wrong with you. The book doesn't support that belief. It suggests something more unsettling, that your environment may be perfectly designed to keep you exactly as you are. Think about how often you promise yourself change, starting tomorrow. That promise itself brings relief. The brain receives the reward without the action. This is not motivation. This is self-soothing, and the behavior loop closes without anything actually changing. You've done this too, haven't you? Watson doesn't moralize this. He doesn't call it laziness or weakness. He calls it conditioning. When intention itself becomes the reward, action becomes optional. And optional actions rarely survive discomfort. The book then introduces a crucial idea that many readers miss. To change behavior, you don't argue with it. You replace it. The brain does not like empty spaces. Remove a response without inserting an alternative, and the old one will return under pressure. This is why most people relapse into old patterns the moment stress appears. Stress doesn't create habits. It reveals them. This is no longer theoretical. Notice what you do when you feel overwhelmed. Do you withdraw? Distract? Overwork? Numb yourself? These are not flaws. These are strategies your system learned because they worked once. The problem is not that you learned them. The problem is that you never updated them. Watson believed that behavior change requires deliberate reconditioning. That means pairing new actions with immediate reinforcement. Not long-term goals, not abstract values. Immediate consequences the brain can feel. This is where most self-help advice quietly fails. It speaks to the future while behavior listens to the present. You won't enjoy hearing this. If a new behavior feels unrewarding at first, it will not last. No matter how important it is, no matter how badly you want it. Wanting is not reinforcement. Feeling is. This is where resistance appears. People say, so I have to manipulate myself. Watson would say you already are. You are just doing it unconsciously. The only difference now is honesty. Either you design your conditioning, or you remain inside someone else's design. There's a moment in the book where this becomes deeply uncomfortable. Watson implies that society itself functions through conditioning. Praise, punishment, status, shame, these are tools. And once you see them as tools, you start noticing how often your behavior is guided without your consent. This is no longer a character in a book. This is you, moving through daily life, responding to invisible levers. Be honest with yourself. How many of your decisions are actually reactions to approval or fear of disapproval? How often do you call something a preference when it's really a conditioned comfort zone? A small correction appears here, quietly. If behavior is learned through repetition and reinforcement, then small changes matter more than dramatic ones. One interrupted response is more powerful than 10 inspirational realizations. One moment of acting differently under familiar pressure begins to weaken the old association. But here's the mistake most people make. They wait to feel ready. They wait for confidence. Watson would say confidence is the byproduct, not the prerequisite. Acting without confidence feels wrong only because your system was trained to avoid uncertainty. That feeling is not a warning. It is withdrawal from an old reward. If you're lying to yourself, don't continue. Because the next part of this journey forces a confrontation with something even harder to accept, the idea that some of your deepest beliefs about who you are exist only to protect behaviors you're afraid to change. And once you see that, there's no comfortable way back. By now, something subtle should be happening inside you. Not motivation. Not excitement. Something quieter and more disturbing. A slow suspicion that many of your strongest beliefs might not be guiding your behavior at all, but protecting it. Watson leans into this discomfort deliberately. He knows that as long as people believe their beliefs lead their actions, they will never question the actions themselves. Let me be honest with you. Most beliefs are not formed to discover truth. They are formed to reduce inner conflict. When a behavior repeats often enough, the mind builds a story around it to make it feel intentional, justified, even noble. This is not philosophy. This is psychological housekeeping. And once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. Think about how often you say things like, I work better under pressure, or I'm just not a morning person, or I don't like confrontation. These sound like personality traits. Watson would say they are explanations created after the fact. They protect patterns that were rewarded in the past. Pressure once produced results, so procrastination became safe. Avoidance once prevented pain, so silence became a virtue. This is not just a story, this is your habit. And the danger isn't that the habit exists. The danger is that the belief around it makes it invisible. Now you might be thinking, but some beliefs are true. Of course they are. Watson is not saying all beliefs are false. He is saying many of them are unexamined. And unexamined beliefs quietly decide what behaviors are even allowed to enter your awareness. If a belief says, people like me don't do that, the behavior doesn't even get a chance. This is where people stop reading. Because the next idea removes another layer of comfort. Watson suggests that identity itself can become a conditioned cage. Once you label yourself, your behavior begins serving the label instead of reality. You stop asking, what works, and start asking, what fits who I think I am? Be honest with yourself. How many opportunities did you dismiss not because they were wrong, but because they didn't match your self-image? How many skills did you avoid learning because they threatened the story you tell about yourself? Watson's approach is ruthless here. He treats identity not as something sacred, but as something functional. If an identity produces effective behavior, it survives. If it doesn't, it should be questioned. This idea is dangerous because it asks you to loosen your grip on who you think you are. And for many people, that grip is the only sense of stability they have. There is a quote often attributed to this line of thinking, we are what we repeatedly do. It sounds harmless until you really sit with it. Because if that's true, then intention means very little. Desire means very little. What matters is repetition. And repetition doesn't care how you see yourself. If you ignore this, something subtle happens. You start defending behaviors instead of improving them. You argue for your limitations. You surround yourself with people who normalize your patterns. And slowly, your life becomes consistent but small. Watson introduces another uncomfortable truth here. The mind prefers consistency over accuracy. It would rather be wrong in a familiar way than uncertain in a new one. This is why people cling to beliefs even when evidence contradicts them. The belief isn't there to be correct. It's there to be stable. This line might make you uncomfortable. Growth often feels like self-betrayal at first. When you act outside a conditioned identity, your system reacts as if something is wrong. Anxiety appears. Doubt increases. The old belief screams for reinforcement. This is not failure. This is withdrawal. This is no longer a character in a book. This is you the moment you try to act differently and feel strangely guilty or fake. You've felt this before. The feeling that says, this isn't me. Watson would say that feeling is not truth. It's habit protesting disruption. Here's where most people make a critical mistake. They interpret discomfort as evidence they're on the wrong path. They retreat to what feels natural. But what feels natural is often just what's familiar, and familiarity is not the same as alignment. A small correction appears here, and it's important. Watson does not suggest abandoning all beliefs. He suggests testing them through behavior. Instead of asking, "Who am I?" he asks, "What happens if I act differently?" This shifts the entire process from identity to experimentation. Now you might be thinking this sounds cold or mechanical, but notice something. This approach removes shame. If behavior is an experiment, failure becomes data, not a verdict. Mistakes stop meaning, "This is who I am," and start meaning, "This didn't work under these conditions." This is where resistance appears again, because experiments require uncertainty, and uncertainty is something your conditioning was designed to avoid. You were rewarded for predictability, not exploration. So the moment you step outside a known pattern, your system tries to pull you back with doubt, fatigue, or distraction. If you are lying to yourself, don't continue, because the next realization is harder to face. Many of your emotional reactions are not responses to the present moment. They are echoes of earlier conditioning protecting an identity that no longer serves you. Think about how quickly you feel threatened when someone challenges your view, even gently. That reaction is not about truth. It's about stability. The belief feels like you, so questioning it feels like attack. And once you see that, arguments stop being intellectual. They become emotional defenses. Watson believed that to change behavior deeply, you must be willing to feel temporarily disoriented, not knowing who you are for a moment, acting without the comfort of identity, letting behavior lead and allowing the mind to catch up later. A small win happens here, quietly. When you act differently despite the discomfort, and nothing catastrophic happens, the belief weakens, just a little, enough to create space, enough to breathe, enough to consider that maybe who you are is not fixed, but in motion. But here's the uneasy truth you can't ignore. If identity can be conditioned, then so can confidence, courage, and even meaning. And that raises a question most people avoid. If who you are is shaped by repetition, then what have you been repeating without noticing? And what kind of person is that repetition quietly building right now? By this point, the illusion that emotions simply happen should feel harder to hold on to. Watson doesn't treat emotions as sacred signals from some deep inner self. He treats them as learned reactions, tied to patterns just like habits and beliefs. This is where the book becomes truly unsettling, because emotions are the last place people want to question their own conditioning. Let me be honest with you, most people trust their emotions more than their actions. They say things like, "I feel it in my gut," or, "My emotions never lie." Watson would challenge that gently but firmly. He would ask where that emotion learned to appear in the first place. What event paired this feeling with this situation? Because emotions don't emerge in a vacuum. They are responses that were reinforced. Think about fear. Fear feels like truth. It feels urgent and protective. But Watson argues that fear often outlives its original purpose. A situation that once caused embarrassment, rejection, or pain trains the nervous system to react before the mind can evaluate. Later, the emotion appears without context, and you assume it is accurate. This is not intuition. This is memory wearing a disguise. This is not just a story. This is your habit. You hesitate, your chest tightens, your mind fills with reasons. You tell yourself you are being cautious or realistic. But if you look closely, the reaction arrived before the reasoning. The emotion set the direction, and the thoughts followed to justify it. Here's where people stop reading. Because questioning emotions feels like self-betrayal. People believe that if they don't obey their feelings, they are being inauthentic. Watson flips this entirely. He suggests that obeying conditioned emotions without examination is the real betrayal. You are letting the past dictate the present. Be honest with yourself. How many times have you avoided action because of a feeling you never investigated? How often did you call it, not the right time, when it was actually fear asking to be protected? Watson points out something most people miss. Emotions are strengthened by attention. The more you pause to analyze, soothe, or explain an emotional reaction, the more real and important it becomes to the system. This is not healing. This is reinforcement. The brain learns, when I produce this feeling, everything stops. This line might make you uncomfortable. Over-identifying with emotions can trap you inside them. Feeling deeply does not mean feeling accurately. And if you build your life around protecting feelings instead of testing them, your behavior will slowly shrink. This is where the book introduces a hard correction. Emotions are not commands. They are signals. And signals are meant to be interpreted, not blindly followed. But interpretation requires distance. And distance feels wrong to a system trained to react. This is no longer theoretical. Notice what happens when you feel anxiety and immediately adjust your behavior to reduce it. You cancel, you delay, you distract. relief follows. And in that relief, the brain learns the lesson. Anxiety works. Next time, it arrives faster. You've done this too, haven't you? And each time, the emotional threshold lowers. What once caused mild discomfort now causes strong avoidance. This is how lives quietly narrow. Watson believed that emotional regulation is not about suppression. It's about reconditioning. That means allowing an emotion to be present without letting it decide the action. This sounds simple, but it is one of the hardest things a human can do, because it removes the immediate reward of relief. If you are lying to yourself, don't continue, because this is the moment where people either reclaim agency or double down on avoidance. Sitting with an emotion without acting on it feels like danger because your system was trained to escape it. But escape is not resolution, it's rehearsal. Here's the small win, and it matters. The first time you feel an emotion and choose a different response, nothing dramatic happens. The world doesn't collapse. The feeling rises, peaks, and falls. That experience alone begins to weaken the old association. Not permanently, but noticeably. Resistance appears right after. The mind says, that was unnecessary, or, I shouldn't have done that. This is not truth speaking. This is the old pattern asking to be restored. And if you give in here, the system learns that persistence wins. Watson also addresses positive emotions, and this is where things get subtle. Pleasure, excitement, even motivation can be conditioned in unhelpful ways. If pleasure only comes from escape, distraction, or external validation, the brain learns to avoid effort. You are not unmotivated. You are rewarded. This is no longer a character in a book. This is you scrolling for comfort instead of building capacity. This is you chasing short highs and wondering why long-term satisfaction feels distant. The emotion is real. The conditioning behind it is the problem. Be honest, how often do you wait to feel in the mood before acting? Watson would say mood follows action far more reliably than action follows mood. Waiting for emotion to lead is another way of surrendering control to conditioning. A correction occurs here. When you act first and let emotion catch up, the emotional system slowly recalibrates. What once felt heavy becomes lighter. What once felt impossible becomes familiar. Not because you forced it, but because you changed the pairing between feeling and action. But here's the uncomfortable realization that won't let you rest. If emotions are conditioned responses, then your emotional life is not a reflection of reality. It is a reflection of your past reinforcements. And that raises a question you can't avoid. If you keep honoring every emotion as truth, whose past are you really living in right now? At this stage, the discomfort should feel different. Not sharp, not loud, but persistent. Like something you can't quite push away anymore. Watson would say that this is what happens when conditioning is exposed but not yet replaced. The old system is still active, but the illusion of innocence is gone. You can't pretend you don't see it now. Let me be honest with you. Once people understand that behavior, belief, and emotion are learned, they often rush toward control. They want techniques, systems, methods. Watson slows them down here. He insists that before control, there must be observation. Because you cannot change a pattern you still secretly protect. Most people think they know themselves because they know their thoughts. Watson disagrees. He argues that thoughts are the least reliable data. Behavior is the truth. What you repeatedly do under pressure tells the real story. Not what you plan, not what you promise. What actually happens when comfort and fear are on the line. This is not just a story, this is your habit. Think about the last time you said you would change something and didn't. What stopped you wasn't logic. It was an invisible pull toward the familiar. And the mind rushed in afterward to clean it up with reasons. Here's where people stop reading. Because the book now asks you to watch yourself without intervening. To notice patterns without fixing them yet. This sounds passive, but it's not. It's uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that your behavior is random or justified. You start seeing how predictable you are. Be honest with yourself. Do you know what you do when you feel criticized? When you feel ignored? When you feel uncertain? If you can predict your own response, you are looking at conditioning, not personality. Watson believed that awareness without honesty is useless. People observe themselves but soften the truth. They rename avoidance as rest. They call control boundaries. They label fear intuition. The system stays intact because it never gets named clearly. This line might make you uncomfortable. Clarity threatens comfort. Once a pattern is named accurately, you lose the right to pretend you didn't know. And that creates pressure. Not from the world, but from yourself. The book then introduces a critical distinction. There is a difference between pain and discomfort. Pain signals harm. Discomfort signals change. Conditioned systems blur the two. Anything unfamiliar feels dangerous. And so people protect themselves from growth while believing they are protecting themselves from damage. This is no longer a character in a book. This is you avoiding necessary conversations, delaying important actions, staying in familiar dissatisfaction. Not because it's good, but because it's known. Watson explains that conditioning thrives on immediacy. Immediate relief beats delayed reward almost every time. That's why people choose what feels better now over what works later. The brain is not designed for long-term wisdom. It is designed for short-term survival. If you ignore this, you will keep designing plans that collapse under stress. You will keep blaming yourself for lack of discipline, while ignoring the fact that your system was never trained for delayed reinforcement. Here's the correction, and it's precise. To change behavior, you must attach immediate, tangible consequences to new actions, not dramatic ones, subtle ones. Relief must be replaced with something else: satisfaction, pride, completion. Even mild discomfort can be reframed as progress if it is paired consistently. You won't enjoy hearing this. Change initially feels worse, not better. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling motivation, not transformation. The first phase of reconditioning removes rewards before it introduces new ones. And that gap is where most people quit. Resistance appears loudly here. The mind starts negotiating. Just this once. You deserve a break. It won't matter. These are not thoughts. They are withdrawal symptoms. The old behavior is losing its automatic reward and fighting to survive. If you are lying to yourself, don't continue. Because this is the moment where honesty matters more than effort. If you keep rationalizing, you are choosing familiarity over freedom. A small win happens quietly when you do the new behavior without feeling rewarded yet. Nothing dramatic. Just the fact that you did it. That moment matters more than it feels like it should. Because it introduces a crack in inevitability. The pattern is no longer guaranteed. Watson emphasizes repetition over intensity. One dramatic effort followed by collapse teaches the system nothing. Small, consistent actions under similar conditions retrain responses. This is boring. And boredom is where change either becomes real or disappears. This is where most people make another mistake. They wait for certainty. They want to be sure the new behavior is right. Watson would say certainty is a luxury of stable patterns. Change requires acting without reassurance. Acting while doubt is still present. Be honest. How often have you delayed action waiting to feel convinced? That waiting is not wisdom. It is fear asking for permission to stay. The book also warns about false progress. People change behavior in safe conditions and call it growth. Then under pressure, they revert. Real change shows up when stress appears and the response shifts even slightly. That slight shift is not small. It is everything. This is no longer theory. This is you the next time you feel the familiar urge and choose differently, even for a moment. That moment rewrites more than 100 affirmations ever could. But here's the truth that doesn't let you rest. Conditioning does not disappear. It weakens. It waits. And if you stop paying attention, it returns quietly, dressed as reason, comfort, or self-care. So the real question becomes unavoidable. If your old patterns are patient and persistent, are you willing to be more patient and persistent than they are, or will you hand control back the moment it asks politely? By now, you may have noticed something unsettling. The problem is no longer ignorance. You know enough. You see the patterns. And yet, change still feels fragile. Watson would say this is the most honest stage of all. This is where excuses stop working, but results haven't arrived yet. And this middle space is where most people quietly return to their old lives. Let me be honest with you. The mind hates unfinished transitions. It wants either comfort or certainty. When neither is available, it creates pressure, restlessness, doubt, irritation. People often misinterpret this as failure. Watson saw it as evidence that reconditioning had actually begun. Here's the mistake many people make at this point. They assume progress should feel encouraging. They expect clarity to bring relief. But early change often feels disorienting. You no longer fully believe the old story, but the new one hasn't stabilized. You feel exposed, less protected, and that vulnerability triggers old defenses. This is not just a story, this is your habit. The moment you start acting differently, a voice appears saying, "You're overthinking this," or "You were fine before." That voice is not wisdom. It's the old system trying to restore equilibrium. Watson emphasized something most people overlook. Conditioning doesn't collapse all at once. It weakens in layers. Surface behaviors may change first, but deeper responses lag behind. You might act differently while still feeling the same emotions. That mismatch confuses people. They think something is wrong because they don't feel aligned yet. This line might make you uncomfortable. Feeling follows consistency, not insight. If you wait to feel different before acting consistently, you will wait forever. The emotional system updates slowly. It needs repetition, not persuasion. This is where people stop reading. Because the book now asks for something deeply counterintuitive: patience with discomfort, not tolerance, not suppression, patience. The willingness to stay present while the old rewards fade and the new ones haven't fully formed. Be honest with yourself. How quickly do you rush to fix uncomfortable feelings? How often do you interrupt the process because you want reassurance that you're doing it right? That urgency is not helpful. It's a learned reaction to uncertainty. Watson argued that most people abandon change not because it's too hard, but because it's too quiet. There's no applause, no immediate payoff, no dramatic signal that says, this is working. The absence of feedback feels like failure to a system trained on instant reinforcement. This is no longer theoretical. Think about how often you equate intensity with effectiveness. You feel productive when you feel busy. You feel changed when you feel emotional. But conditioning doesn't care about how it feels. It cares about what repeats. A critical correction appears here. You don't need to feel confident to continue. You need to feel consistent. Confidence is an emotion. Consistency is behavior. And behavior is what trains the system. Resistance becomes more sophisticated at this stage. It no longer screams. It whispers. It uses logic. It says, you've done enough, or you can relax now, or you'll come back to this later. These thoughts feel reasonable. That's what makes them dangerous. If you're lying to yourself, don't continue. Because this is the phase where honesty becomes non-negotiable. You must distinguish between rest and retreat, between patience and procrastination, between kindness and avoidance. They feel similar. They are not. Watson also addresses relapse here, and he does something important. He normalizes it without excusing it. Relapse is not proof that change is impossible. It's proof that old conditioning is still present. The mistake is not slipping. The mistake is interpreting the slip as identity. This is where many people quietly give up. They say, see, this is just how I am. But Watson would say that statement itself is a conditioned response, a familiar narrative stepping in to protect the old pattern from further challenge. Here's the small win, and it's subtle. The moment you notice a relapse without dramatizing it, something changes. You didn't disappear into it. You didn't build a story around it. You saw it as behavior, not destiny. That moment weakens the old association more than perfection ever could. This is no longer a character in a book. This is you choosing to return to the new behavior after slipping, without punishment or justification. That return is the real training. Not the streak, not the record, the return. Watson believed that systems learn from what happens next, not from what you intended. If relapse is followed by shame, the brain learns avoidance. If relapse is followed by calm correction, the brain learns resilience. You won't enjoy hearing this. Self-judgment is one of the strongest reinforcers of old behavior. It feels corrective, but it actually deepens the loop. Because shame demands relief, and relief usually comes from the very behavior you're trying to change. Be honest, how often have you punished yourself and called it accountability? How often did that actually help? Another resistance appears here. People start seeking reassurance from others, validation, permission. They want someone to tell them they're doing it right. Watson would say this shifts control outward again. The system learns to depend on approval instead of internal consistency. A correction occurs when you continue without reassurance, when you let behavior be quiet, when you stop announcing change and start embodying it. This feels lonely at first, but loneliness is often just the absence of familiar feedback, not the absence of progress. This is where most transformations fail silently. Not because the person wasn't capable, but because they mistook the neutral phase for stagnation. They thought nothing was happening because nothing felt dramatic. But something is happening. Associations are weakening. Expectations are shifting. The system is recalibrating. Slowly, unimpressively, effectively. And here's the truth that won't let you rest. If real change happens quietly and old patterns return loudly, then the real danger isn't effort or failure. It's impatience. So the question you have to face now is this: when the noise of your old conditioning gets louder and the results of your new behavior stay quiet, which one are you actually prepared to listen to? At this point, something critical is happening beneath the surface, whether you like it or not. The battle is no longer between old behavior and new behavior. It's between interpretation and reality. Watson understood this stage well. He knew that once people survive the early discomfort without dramatic results, the mind looks for meaning. And meaning can either strengthen the change or quietly sabotage it. Let me be honest with you. Humans don't suffer most from pain. They suffer from confusion. When effort doesn't immediately translate into visible improvement, the mind starts asking dangerous questions. Is this worth it? Am I doing it wrong? Shouldn't this feel different by now? These questions don't come from curiosity. They come from a system trained to expect fast feedback. This is not just a story, this is your habit. You start measuring progress emotionally instead of behaviorally. You check how motivated you feel instead of what you actually did. And when the feeling doesn't match your expectations, doubt creeps in. Watson would say this is where conditioning gets clever. The old pattern doesn't need to pull you back directly anymore. It just needs to make the new path feel meaningless. Once meaning collapses, behavior soon follows. This is where people stop reading. Because the book now asks you to confront a hard truth, progress often feels boring before it feels empowering. The nervous system doesn't celebrate stability. It barely notices it. So when chaos decreases, the absence of drama can feel like emptiness. Be honest with yourself. How often have you mistaken calm for stagnation? How often have you created problems just to feel movement again? That impulse isn't ambition. It's addiction to intensity. Watson explains that many people are conditioned not just to certain behaviors, but to certain emotional climates. Stress, urgency, struggle, these can become familiar homes. When life starts to feel neutral, the system feels lost, and so it unconsciously recreates tension. This line might make you uncomfortable. Peace can feel unsafe to a system trained on survival. If you grew up or lived in constant pressure, calm feels suspicious. You wait for something to go wrong, and in that waiting, you often make it happen. This is no longer theoretical. This is you feeling restless even when nothing is wrong. This is you questioning progress because it doesn't hurt enough. Watson would say this is not intuition. It's conditioning missing its usual stimulation. A critical correction appears here. You must learn to measure progress by stability, not excitement. By fewer reactions, not stronger emotions. By consistency under pressure, not intensity during motivation. This redefinition feels wrong at first because it offers no immediate reward. Resistance shows up again, but now it wears a smarter mask. It says, you're settling, or you're losing your edge, or you used to be more driven. But what it's really saying is, I miss the old familiar struggle. If you're lying to yourself, don't continue. Because romanticizing struggle is one of the most effective ways people stay stuck. Pain feels meaningful. Calm feels empty until you learn how to inhabit it. Watson also warns about another trap at this stage: comparison. When your own progress feels quiet, you start scanning others for signals. Who's ahead? Who's happier? Who seems more alive? This is not inspiration. It's uncertainty looking for external calibration. This is no longer a character in a book. This is you scrolling, observing, measuring yourself against fragments of other people's lives. And every comparison subtly pulls you away from your own process. Here's the small win, and it's easy to miss. You begin to notice longer gaps between urges, shorter emotional spikes, less internal negotiation. These changes don't feel heroic. They feel almost disappointing. But they are signs that the system is learning a new baseline. Watson believed that behavior change becomes real when you stop thinking about it constantly, when it becomes mundane, when it no longer requires an identity shift or emotional narrative, just something you do. But this is also where another mistake appears. People interpret "it feels normal now" as "it's not working anymore," so they abandon it. They forget that the goal was never to feel changed. The goal was to change. You won't enjoy hearing this. Wanting to feel transformed is often just another desire for stimulation. Real transformation often feels like less, not more. Less noise, less urgency, less drama. Be honest, how much of your identity was built around struggle? Around fixing yourself? Around being in process? If the process ends, who are you without the tension? Watson subtly points to this without answering it directly. He suggests that many people resist completion because completion removes their excuses. As long as you are working on yourself, you don't have to fully show up. You don't have to fully show up. You don't have to risk living without the safety net of explanation. A correction happens when you stop announcing progress and start living it quietly. When you let days pass without evaluating yourself. When you allow improvement to be ordinary. But here's the uncomfortable realization that lingers. If stability feels boring and struggle feels meaningful, then part of you may be more attached to the problem than the solution. And if that's true, the next question becomes unavoidable. Are you actually trying to change your behavior, or are you trying to preserve a familiar version of yourself that knows how to survive, but not how to live? By now, the resistance has changed its tone. It's no longer loud doubt or obvious fear. It's subtle. It's fatigue. A quiet thought that says, "I'm tired of thinking about this." Watson recognized this moment as a critical turning point. Not because people fail here loudly, but because they drift. And drifting looks harmless until you realize you're back where you started. Let me be honest with you. The mind loves closure. It wants a finish line. A moment where effort ends and reward becomes permanent. Conditioning doesn't work that way. It requires maintenance, not obsession. And when people confuse maintenance with endless struggle, they quit out of resentment. This is not just a story, this is your habit. You either push too hard and burn out, or you relax too much and slip back. Both come from the same misunderstanding, that change is something you do for a while, not something you integrate. Watson would say the goal is not to stay disciplined. The goal is to build systems where discipline is rarely needed. But systems don't announce themselves. They operate quietly in the background, and because they feel normal, people underestimate their importance. This is where people stop reading. Because the book now removes the last fantasy, that you can return to unconscious living once you've seen the pattern. You can't. Awareness changes the rules. When you know what's happening, slipping back doesn't feel neutral anymore. It feels like betrayal. Be honest with yourself. When you avoid the new behavior now, doesn't it feel different than before? Not worse, just clearer. You know what you're doing. That clarity is not punishment, it's responsibility. Watson talks about something rarely discussed: the boredom of health. Stable behavior doesn't create stories. It doesn't generate emotional highs. It just works. And for people used to emotional intensity, this can feel empty. They mistake the absence of drama for absence of meaning. This line might make you uncomfortable. You may have been trained to equate chaos with depth. If nothing is wrong, you feel useless. And so you unconsciously search for friction. This is no longer theoretical. This is you feeling restless on a good day. This is you questioning calm. Watson would say your nervous system hasn't learned how to rest yet. Not sleep, rest. A correction appears here, and it's subtle. You stop looking for feelings to confirm progress. You look at outcomes. Are things more stable? Are reactions less extreme? Is recovery quicker? These are quiet metrics, but they are honest ones. Resistance shows up again as nostalgia. You remember how intense things used to feel, how driven, how emotional, and you wonder if you've lost something. Watson would ask you a dangerous question in return: did that intensity actually serve you, or did it just feel alive? If you're lying to yourself, don't continue, because romanticizing the past is one of the easiest ways to sabotage the present. You forget the cost and remember only the energy. Here's the small win, and it's important. You start trusting boring consistency more than emotional certainty. You stop checking in with your mood before acting. You act, and let mood adjust later. This reverses the old hierarchy. Watson believed that freedom is not the ability to do whatever you feel. It's the ability to do what works even when you don't feel like it. That's not suppression. That's maturity. This is no longer a character in a book. This is you choosing to continue without inspiration. This is you letting the system carry you when motivation is absent. And that's when change becomes sustainable. But another mistake appears here. People think maintenance means disengagement. They stop paying attention. They assume the pattern is gone. Watson would warn that conditioning weakens, but it never forgets. Under stress, old responses look for openings. This is where humility becomes essential. Not fear, not vigilance. Humility. The understanding that you are not cured. You are trained differently now. And training requires upkeep. You won't enjoy hearing this. There is no final arrival. There is only ongoing alignment. The moment you declare yourself finished, you stop reinforcing the behaviors that got you here. Be honest, how often have you dropped something the moment it stopped feeling urgent? That's not because it failed. It's because urgency was your fuel, not intention. A correction happens when you build gentle reminders into your life. Structures that guide behavior without force. Environments that reduce friction. Choices that make the right action easier than the wrong one. Watson's philosophy circles back to where it began. Behavior is shaped by conditions. If you maintain the conditions, the behavior holds. If you neglect them, the old patterns return, not out of malice, but out of familiarity. And here's the unease that stays with you. If change doesn't end, only stabilizes, then the real question isn't whether you can transform. It's whether you can respect the quiet, ongoing work required to remain who you've become, or whether you'll abandon it the moment it stops feeling like a journey. At this stage, the struggle isn't about doing the wrong thing anymore. It's about explaining why you do the right thing. That might sound strange, but Watson understood this phase well. Once behavior stabilizes, the mind rushes in to rebuild identity around it. And this is where a new trap quietly forms. Let me be honest with you. Humans don't like behaving without a story. We want meaning, labels, narratives. When a new behavior starts working, the mind tries to claim ownership. This is who I am now. That sounds healthy, but Watson would caution you to slow down here. This is not just a story, this is your habit. You replace one identity with another. You swap "I'm bad at this" for "I'm disciplined." And without realizing it, you've rebuilt a fragile structure that needs constant protection. Here's where people stop reading. Because the book now challenges something that feels like progress. Watson warns that identity-based change is unstable. The moment behavior depends on a label, it becomes defensive. You start acting not because it works, but because it proves something. Be honest with yourself. Have you ever felt pressure to maintain an image once you adopted it? To perform consistency instead of simply being consistent? That pressure is not growth. It's conditioning wearing new clothes. Watson believed that the most stable behaviors are the ones that don't require explanation. You don't announce them. You don't defend them. You just do them because the environment supports them and the cost of not doing them is higher. This line might make you uncomfortable. Needing to be seen as changed is often a sign that change hasn't fully integrated yet. Real integration reduces the need for validation. This is no longer theoretical. This is you feeling irritated when someone questions your new behavior. This is you explaining choices that actually work for you. That irritation is not about them. It's about the identity feeling threatened. A critical correction appears here. Let behavior stand alone. Stop wrapping it in adjectives. Stop turning it into proof of character. When you act because it works, not because it says something about you, the behavior becomes resilient. Resistance shows up again as pride. Pride isn't always loud. Sometimes it's subtle satisfaction that says, I'm not like them anymore. Watson would say this is dangerous. The moment you separate yourself, you stop observing yourself. If you're lying to yourself, don't continue. Because superiority is one of the fastest ways conditioning sneaks back in. It blinds you to small slips and turns feedback into offense. Watson also addresses social reinforcement here. People around you start responding to your change. They comment, they adjust. Some approve, some resist. This feedback is powerful. And if you're not careful, your behavior begins responding to them instead of the original function. This is no longer a character in a book. This is you changing how you act depending on who's watching. Being consistent alone, flexible in public. That split is exhausting. And it slowly erodes the stability you built. Here's the small win. You start noticing when you're tempted to perform instead of act. You catch the impulse to explain, and you let it pass. That restraint matters. It keeps the behavior grounded in utility, not ego. Watson believed that the strongest conditioning is invisible. When a behavior becomes part of the environment instead of the identity, it no longer needs protection. It just exists. You won't enjoy hearing this. Letting go of the story can feel like losing something. The praise, the recognition, the sense of becoming. But what you gain is something quieter and stronger, reliability. Be honest, how much of your motivation was fueled by being seen differently? And if that disappears, does the behavior still stand? A correction happens when you shift focus back to cause and effect. When you notice what improves your life and what degrades it, without moralizing either, without turning it into who you are. Watson's philosophy keeps stripping things down. First beliefs, then emotions, now identity. What remains is behavior interacting with conditions. Simple, unforgiving, effective. This is where many people feel strangely empty. Without the old chaos and without a new story, there's a gap. Watson would say this gap is not a problem. It's space. Space to choose without performing. But here's the uneasy realization that lingers. If you no longer define yourself by your struggles or your improvements, then the question becomes uncomfortable. Who are you when you stop needing your behavior to mean something? And can you live without that meaning long enough for something real to take its place? Something shifts quietly here, not in your actions, but in how you relate to control. Up to this point, change may have felt like something you were managing, monitoring, adjusting. Watson knew this phase well, because this is where people either relax into alignment or tighten their grip and break what they built. Let me be honest with you. The desire to control is often the last habit to go. Even when behavior improves, the mind wants to supervise every move. It scans for mistakes, future risks, potential failures. This vigilance feels responsible. It isn't. It's fear trying to stay relevant. This is not just a story, this is your habit. You double, check yourself even when things are working. You question your own stability. You brace for collapse. And in doing so, you reintroduce tension into a system that was finally learning to settle. Here's where people stop reading. Because the book now suggests something that feels reckless, letting go of constant self-monitoring. Watson believed that once a behavior is conditioned, excessive awareness can actually destabilize it. The system doesn't need scrutiny. It needs consistency. Be honest with yourself. How often do you interrupt momentum by overthinking it? How many times have you turned a good day into a stressful one by evaluating it too closely? Watson argued that healthy systems self-regulate when conditions remain stable. You don't think about walking once you know how to walk. You don't analyze every step. And yet, people try to micromanage new behaviors as if attention itself were the glue holding everything together. This line might make you uncomfortable. Constant vigilance is not discipline. It's insecurity. And insecurity keeps the nervous system alert, not stable. This is no longer theoretical. This is you feeling anxious when things go smoothly, waiting for the other shoe to drop, interpreting ease as fragility instead of progress. A critical correction appears here. You learn to trust patterns instead of moods. You stop checking how you feel and start noticing whether the system still works under normal conditions. This shift is subtle, but powerful. Resistance shows up again as fear of regression. The thought appears, if I stop paying attention, I'll lose everything. Watson would say this belief is itself a remnant of old conditioning. It assumes collapse is your natural state. If you're lying to yourself, don't continue. Because clinging to control often recreates the very instability you're trying to prevent. Tension invites error. Watson also explores the idea of trust here. Not trust in yourself as a concept, but trust in the process. Trust that repetition has done its job. Trust that slips can be corrected without panic. Trust that stability doesn't require constant proving. This is no longer a character in a book. This is you allowing a routine to exist without inspecting it daily. This is you letting a habit run quietly in the background, and noticing that life doesn't fall apart. Here's the small win, and it's easy to miss. You catch yourself not thinking about the behavior at all. Hours pass, days even, And when you notice, the behavior is still there. That absence of effort is not neglect. It's integration. You won't enjoy hearing this. Control feels productive. Letting go feels passive. But real conditioning doesn't need supervision. It needs continuity. Be honest, how much of your identity was built around working on yourself? Who are you when there's nothing to fix today? Watson suggests that many people unconsciously sabotage stability because stability removes their sense of purpose. If you're no longer struggling, what are you striving against? This question creates existential discomfort, and the mind tries to resolve it by creating new problems. A correction happens when you allow life to be uneventful without labeling it empty. When you let days pass without improvement narratives. When you allow yourself to simply function. This doesn't mean complacency. It means efficiency. Energy is no longer wasted on self-surveillance. It's available for living. But here's the truth that lingers. If you no longer need to control every behavior, every emotion, every outcome, then the final illusion begins to crack. Maybe control was never the source of safety. Maybe it was the source of tension. And if that's true, the question becomes unavoidable. When you stop gripping so tightly, what are you actually afraid will happen? And what does that fear say about the way you've been trained to survive? There's a quiet vulnerability that appears now, and it doesn't announce itself as fear. It shows up as openness. A strange sense that you are no longer armoring yourself the way you used to. Watson would say this is not weakness. This is what happens when defensive conditioning loosens its grip. And for many people, this stage is more frightening than the chaos they escaped. Let me be honest with you. When old patterns fall away, they don't just take pain with them. They take protection. You begin to feel things more directly, less buffered, less numbed. And without realizing it, you start wondering whether the old habits were doing something important after all. This is not just a story. This is your habit. You catch yourself thinking, I was tougher before, or, I didn't overthink this much back then. But look closer. Were you tougher, or were you just more defended? Was that strength, or was it avoidance disguised as resilience? Here's where people stop reading, because the book now exposes something deeply uncomfortable. Many coping behaviors that hurt us also kept us from feeling exposed. When they fade, you don't just lose the damage, you lose the armor. And without armor, you feel seen, even when no one is watching. Be honest with yourself. Do you sometimes miss the old habits not because they worked, but because they hid you? Because they gave you an excuse to stay distant, distracted, or emotionally unavailable? Watson understood this well. He believed that a large portion of human behavior is designed not to succeed, but to avoid vulnerability. Conditioning doesn't just protect us from pain, it protects us from being fully present. And presence can feel terrifying to a system trained on defense. This line might make you uncomfortable. Many people confuse numbness with stability. When numbness fades, they panic and assume something is wrong. But nothing is wrong. You are just no longer buffered. This is no longer theoretical. This is you feeling emotions without immediately escaping them. This is you noticing subtle discomfort in conversations, silence, stillness. Not because anything bad is happening, but because you are actually there. Resistance appears here as self-criticism. You start judging yourself for being too sensitive or too affected. Watson would say this is the old conditioning trying to reinstall the armor. Sensitivity is framed as a flaw because it threatens avoidance. If you are lying to yourself, don't continue, because dismissing your own emotional presence is one of the fastest ways to retreat into old patterns. Here's the correction, and it's crucial. Vulnerability is not a new problem to solve. It's a state to tolerate. The moment you try to fix it, numb it, or justify it, you reinforce the belief that being present is dangerous. Watson believed that emotional tolerance is trained the same way behavior is, through exposure without escape, feeling without reaction, staying without soothing, not dramatically, quietly. This is no longer a character in a book. This is you sitting with an emotion and not reaching for distraction. This is you letting awkwardness pass without filling it. This is you allowing uncertainty to exist without demanding answers. A small win happens here, almost invisibly. You realize that vulnerability doesn't actually destroy you. It doesn't even last as long as you feared. It rises, peaks, and dissolves. And with each cycle, the system learns a new lesson. Presence is survivable. You won't enjoy hearing this. The desire to be strong again is often a desire to be unreachable. But unreachable is not the same as safe. It's just lonely in a familiar way. Be honest. How much of your old strength came from shutting parts of yourself down? And what did that cost you over time? Watson also points out something subtle here. As defenses lower, empathy increases. You feel others more clearly. This can feel overwhelming at first. You are not used to this level of contact, and so you might be tempted to pull back. This is where another mistake appears. People think they need to rebuild boundaries immediately. Sometimes they do, but often, what they really need is tolerance, learning how to stay open without collapsing. This is where the work becomes less about behavior and more about capacity. How much reality can you feel without running? How much presence can you hold without numbing? A correction happens when you stop trying to feel in control and start allowing yourself to feel connected. Connected to your body, your reactions, the moment. Watson's philosophy quietly suggests that freedom is not emotional invulnerability. It's emotional availability without compulsion, feeling without being driven. But here's the uneasy truth that won't let you rest. If your old patterns were protecting you from vulnerability, and vulnerability is now unavoidable, then the question becomes sharp and personal. What were you actually afraid would happen if you were fully present, and is that fear still relevant, or has it simply never been questioned until now? There's a subtle shift that happens now, and it's easy to misunderstand. The discomfort you feel is no longer about fear, effort, or even vulnerability. It's about choice. Watson understood this stage as the moment when conditioning loosens enough that you are no longer being pushed or pulled as strongly. And paradoxically, that freedom can feel heavier than restraint. Let me be honest with you. When old patterns ruled your behavior, life felt narrow but predictable. You knew how you would react. You knew where you would retreat. Now that those reflexes are weaker, you face something unfamiliar: open space. And open space demands decisions without excuses. This is not just a story, this is your habit. You notice yourself hesitating not because you're afraid, but because no automatic response jumps in to decide for you. You feel exposed to choice. And choice feels risky when you can no longer blame conditioning for the outcome. Here's where people stop reading. Because the book now removes the last comfortable shield, inevitability. You can no longer say, "That's just how I am," or "I couldn't help it." You still feel impulses, but they no longer fully control you. And that means responsibility lands squarely in your hands. Be honest with yourself. Do you feel a strange pressure knowing you could respond differently now? That pressure isn't anxiety. It's agency. And many people have spent their entire lives avoiding it. Watson believed that conditioning doesn't just limit behavior, it limits responsibility. When responses are automatic, consequences feel distant. When choice enters the picture, consequences feel personal. And that personal weight is often mistaken for danger. This line might make you uncomfortable. Freedom is heavier than habit. Habit carries you. Freedom asks you to carry yourself. This is no longer theoretical. This is you noticing the pause between impulse and action. That pause is where freedom lives. But it's also where doubt creeps in. What if I choose wrong? What if this costs me? What if I regret it? Resistance appears here as avoidance of choice itself. You delay decisions. You stay undecided. You keep options open. Watson would say this is the old system's final attempt to maintain control by refusing commitment. If you're lying to yourself, don't continue. Because indecision is not neutrality. It's a behavior. And like all behaviors, it trains consequences. Watson emphasized that once conditioning weakens, the nervous system must learn a new skill: tolerating uncertainty without retreat. This is not about confidence. Confidence comes later. This is about staying present while outcomes are unknown. This is no longer a character in a book. This is you making a decision without emotional certainty backing it up. This is you acting without a guarantee, and noticing that the ground doesn't disappear beneath you. A small win happens here, quietly. You choose something simple. You follow through. And the world doesn't punish you for not being sure. That experience matters more than 100 insights. It teaches your system that choice is survivable. You won't enjoy hearing this. Many people secretly miss the old constraints because they removed accountability. When life was shaped by conditioning, failure felt impersonal. Now, success and failure both feel closer. And closeness can feel threatening. Be honest, how often have you hidden behind uncertainty to avoid owning an outcome? How often did "I don't know yet" protect you from being seen trying? Watson also points out that values emerge at this stage. Not declared values, lived ones. When conditioning fades, what remains is what you repeatedly choose when nothing forces you. Those choices reveal what matters to you far more honestly than any belief statement. This realization can be unsettling. You may discover that some things you claim to value don't actually guide your behavior, and some things you never named quietly do. This isn't a failure. It's clarity. A correction happens when you stop trying to choose perfectly and start choosing consistently. Watson believed that values are not discovered through introspection. They are revealed through action over time. This is where mistakes return, but they feel different now. Not like relapse. Like information. You choose. You observe the result. You adjust. No drama. No identity crisis. Just learning. This stage feels oddly ordinary. Less emotional. Less intense. More real. You're no longer fighting yourself, but you're also no longer being carried by habit. You're walking on your own. And here's the truth that doesn't let you rest. If you are no longer trapped by conditioning, then the life you build from here on is not an accident. It is a series of choices you can't unknow. So the question you have to face is this: now that you can no longer hide behind who you were trained to be, what are you actually going to choose to become, day after day, without applause or excuse? There is a quiet honesty that settles in now, and it doesn't feel triumphant. It feels sober. Watson would recognize this stage immediately. It's the moment when people stop asking, "How do I change?" and start asking, "What am I actually living with now?" Not as a complaint, as an assessment. Let me be honest with you. At this point, there's no dramatic enemy left to fight, no obvious bad habit to conquer. What remains is alignment. And alignment is uncomfortable because it removes the drama that once made effort feel meaningful. This is not just a story, this is your habit. You wake up and notice that life feels quieter, more functional. And instead of relief, you feel a strange neutrality. You're not struggling, but you're not chasing either. And the mind, so used to tension, doesn't know what to do with this space. Here's where people stop reading. Because the book now reveals something most people never reach. When behavior stabilizes and conditioning loosens, dissatisfaction doesn't automatically disappear. It just changes its shape. It becomes subtler, harder to blame on circumstances. Be honest with yourself. Have you ever improved your life only to realize that something still feels off? That moment isn't failure. It's the collapse of an illusion, that fixing behavior alone would deliver fulfillment. Watson never promised happiness. He promised clarity. And clarity can feel cold at first. When excuses fall away, you see your life more accurately. What works, what doesn't, what you've been tolerating because it was familiar. This line might make you uncomfortable. Stability reveals truths chaos hides. When things slow down, dissatisfaction has nowhere to hide. And that forces a deeper question. If your life is no longer being sabotaged by old patterns, what exactly is missing? This is no longer theoretical. This is you noticing the gap between functionality and meaning. You're doing better, but you're not sure why you're doing it. Without struggle to define you, motivation feels different, quieter, less urgent. Resistance appears here as restlessness again, but it's different now. Not anxious, existential. You start asking questions about direction instead of discipline, purpose instead of progress. If you're lying to yourself, don't continue. Because this is the point where people often regress intentionally. They create problems to avoid confronting emptiness. They sabotage stability because chaos gives them something to react to. Watson would say this is not self-destruction. It's confusion. When survival patterns fade, the system looks for a new organizing principle. Without it, behavior feels arbitrary. Here's the correction, and it's not motivational. Meaning is not found by thinking harder. It's built through engagement, through choosing something and staying with it long enough for it to matter. Conditioning fades, but commitment must replace it. This is no longer a character in a book. This is you realizing that no habit will save you from choosing what to care about. No system will decide for you. You are no longer reacting. You are initiating. A small win happens here when you stop demanding that life feel exciting and start asking whether it feels honest. Honest with your time, your energy, your attention. That shift changes everything. You won't enjoy hearing this. Meaning often begins as obligation. Not imposed by others, but chosen by you. Something you decide to carry even when it doesn't reward you emotionally yet. Be honest, how often have you abandoned things the moment they stopped stimulating you? How often did you mistake boredom for misalignment? Watson believed that humans are not built to be constantly fulfilled. They are built to adapt. Fulfillment emerges as a byproduct of sustained engagement, not constant pleasure. This stage asks for something very few people practice: choosing without emotional reinforcement, staying without certainty, building without applause. This is where values stop being concepts and start becoming weight. You feel the cost of what you choose and what you don't, and that cost makes things real. A correction occurs when you accept that dissatisfaction doesn't mean something is wrong. It often means you are finally seeing clearly. And clarity is the beginning of responsibility, not the end of struggle. But here's the uneasy truth that lingers. If your life is now quiet enough to hear yourself think, and stable enough that no old pattern is to blame, then the next question cuts deeper than any before. If you are no longer fighting to survive, what are you actually willing to live for, and are you prepared to choose it without waiting for certainty or comfort to guide you? What appears now is not tension, not fear, not even doubt. It's exposure. Watson understood this phase as the moment when nothing internal is left to argue with. No habit to fight, no identity to defend, no conditioning to blame. And when that happens, the mind does something unexpected. It turns outward. Let me be honest with you. When you stop being consumed by your own patterns, you finally have the capacity to notice other people clearly. Not as obstacles, not as mirrors, not as threats. As separate nervous systems, shaped by their own conditioning, struggling just as quietly as you once did. This is not just a story, this is your habit. You listen differently now. You react less. You notice when someone's behavior isn't really about you. And instead of feeling powerful, this awareness can feel heavy. Because you see how much pain is automatic, how much harm is unconscious. Here's where people stop reading. Because the book now removes the final excuse for disengagement. You can no longer say, I'm just focused on myself right now. You see too clearly how your behavior affects others, how your presence regulates or dysregulates the space you enter. Be honest with yourself. Have you felt more responsible lately, not because someone asked you to be, but because you noticed you could be? That sense of responsibility doesn't come from morality. It comes from capacity. Watson believed that as conditioning loosens, social awareness sharpens. You're no longer trapped in your own reactions, so you notice patterns in others. You see when someone is avoiding, when they're posturing, when they're reacting from old wounds. And the question becomes uncomfortable. What do you do with that awareness? This line might make you uncomfortable. Seeing clearly removes innocence. You can no longer pretend ignorance when you choose silence, distance, or indifference. This is no longer theoretical. This is you noticing when your calm steadies a room, or when your withdrawal creates tension. This is you realizing that your behavior doesn't just shape your life, it shapes environments. Resistance appears here as detachment. You tell yourself, that's not my responsibility. Sometimes that's true. Often, it's avoidance in a more mature disguise. Watson would say responsibility grows with capacity, whether you like it or not. If you're lying to yourself, don't continue. Because refusing responsibility when you're capable of influence is still a choice. And choices train consequences. Here's the correction, and it's delicate. Responsibility does not mean saving others. It means not pretending your actions are neutral when they're not. It means choosing responses that don't unconsciously reinforce harm. This is no longer a character in a book. This is you deciding whether to escalate or de-escalate a situation, whether to speak or remain silent, whether to stay present or check out. These decisions now feel sharper because you know they matter. A small win happens here when you act with restraint, not because you're afraid, but because you're aware. You pause before reacting. You choose not to pass on tension. That pause is a form of leadership, whether anyone notices or not. You won't enjoy hearing this. Awareness increases obligation, not imposed by rules, but by reality. When you can see the effect, you can't unknow it. Be honest, how often have you said, that's just how people are, to avoid engaging with the impact of behavior? How often was that resignation protecting your comfort more than your integrity? Watson never framed this as moral superiority. He framed it as systemic influence. Behaviors ripple. Emotional states spread. Environments train people whether intentionally or not. This stage introduces a quiet burden. You realize that peace is not just personal, it's relational. And maintaining it requires ongoing attention, not heroics. A correction occurs when you stop asking whether something is your fault and start asking whether it's your influence. Fault invites defense. Influence invites choice. This is where many people feel tired again, but it's a different tired. Not burnout. Responsibility fatigue. The realization that being conscious is work. That unconsciousness was easier, even if it was more painful. Watson would say this fatigue is temporary. As behavior aligns, responsibility becomes lighter. Not because it disappears, but because it becomes integrated. But here's the truth that refuses to let you rest. If your clarity now extends beyond yourself, and your actions quietly shape the spaces you move through, then the question becomes unavoidable. When no one is watching, no one is praising, and no rule is forcing you, what kind of presence are you choosing to be, and are you willing to live with the ripple effects of that choice? There is no sense of arrival here, no finish line, no moment where everything clicks into place and stays there forever. Watson never offered that. What he offers at the end is something far more unsettling and far more honest: responsibility without drama. Let me be honest with you. By now, nothing is really hidden anymore. You understand how behavior is shaped. You've seen how beliefs protect patterns, how emotions follow conditioning, how identity can become a cage, how freedom introduces weight instead of relief. There is no mystery left to blame, and that clarity changes the tone of life. This is not just a story, this is your habit. You no longer ask, why am I like this? You ask, what am I reinforcing right now? That question doesn't sound poetic. It doesn't feel comforting, but it is real, and reality has a way of quieting unnecessary suffering. Watson ends his philosophy without romance. He doesn't talk about becoming extraordinary. He talks about becoming accurate. Accurate in how you see yourself. Accurate in how you read your reactions. Accurate in how you design your environment. Accuracy replaces self-deception. And self-deception, once removed, doesn't come back easily. Here's where people stop reading. Because accuracy removes fantasy. You no longer get to imagine a future version of yourself who magically fixes everything. You are left with today's actions and tomorrow's consequences, and nothing else. Be honest with yourself. Do you feel a strange mix of calm and exposure right now? That's what happens when illusion fades. Not despair, not joy, just presence. Watson believed that most human suffering comes from living in contradiction. wanting one thing while reinforcing another, saying one value while practicing another. Once behavior and awareness align, suffering reduces, not because life is easy, but because it is no longer divided. This line might make you uncomfortable. You don't need to be more motivated. You need to be less divided. This is no longer theoretical. This is you noticing when you drift, when you excuse, when you subtly avoid, and instead of panicking or judging, you correct, quietly, immediately, without story. A final resistance appears here, and it's subtle. Nostalgia for becoming. The desire to be on a journey again. Watson would say this is the ego missing movement. Stability doesn't flatter the self. It doesn't make you interesting. It makes you reliable. If you're lying to yourself, don't continue. Because wanting to feel like you're evolving can become another distraction from simply living in alignment. Watson's closing philosophy is simple and heavy. Behavior is never finished. Conditioning never disappears. It either weakens or strengthens based on what you repeat. There is no graduation, only upkeep. This is not discouraging. It's grounding. You stop looking for transformation and start practicing maintenance. You stop chasing insight and start honoring structure. You stop waiting for meaning and start building it through consistency. Be honest, how often have you treated maintenance as failure because it wasn't exciting? How much peace did you abandon because it didn't feel profound? The final clarity is this: freedom is not a permanent state. It is a practiced relationship with your own behavior. And like any relationship, neglect changes it. This is no longer a character in a book. This is you tomorrow morning. Not inspired, not afraid, just choosing whether to reinforce what works or slip back into what's familiar. A quiet acceptance settles here. You may never feel finished, and that's not a flaw. That's reality. The goal was never completion. The goal was coherence. Watson doesn't end with hope. He ends with honesty. You are not controlled, but you are always conditionable. You are not trapped, but you are always training something, consciously or not. And this is where the real problem begins, not ends. Because once you see that every ordinary action is a vote for the kind of life you're reinforcing, you lose the comfort of pretending small choices don't matter. So the question that stays with you, long after the book closes, is not whether you understand human behavior anymore. It's this: now that you know exactly how you are shaped, what are you going to keep repeating when no one is guiding you, correcting you, or watching, and are you prepared to live with the person those repetitions will inevitably make you become?